much for the invitation. Actually, I feel really foreign here. So maybe I need to give you like the structure of my presentation beforehand in order for you to understand what's the goal, basically. So the goal is maybe to look out for potentials, for approaches on how to actually use AI, machine learning, etc. in the research on the social acceptance in the field of decarbonization. And in order to do so and to come basically in the end to like the ideas, maybe searching for your inputs, I first want to present to you like my approach, what we do normally and what the goal of our research is. So basically what we are concerned about is to understand and analyze human behavior. And obviously this is quite challenging because human behavior is complex, it's really difficult to predict and also challenging to measure. And I just want to point to you to three particular challenges that we face in our research. The first is we need, of course, data on behavior, obviously. But most of the time we have self-reported data on behavior, and this typically is not the same as real behavior. So we have this lack of observed behavior, and as a compensation, we normally run surveys in order to collect data on behavior, but typically we ask then people questions on, for example, do you intend to invest in PV modules? I mean, normally we do it not that, well, boldly, but it goes in that direction. And these questions are prone to social desirability. So because everybody knows that one should invest in solar PV, people will also indicate in the survey that they are doing whatever is socially desirable. The second one is more structural, and it is the concept of what we refer to as the attitude-behavior gap. This means that we cannot, for example, assume that if somebody tells me that he or she is in favor of the energy transition, that she will also behave in that way. And this is not because people lie or pretend to be something different than they are, but that's just human, because it's just normal that you can be in favor of, for example, renewable energy, but you might have good reasons why you don't accept a specific project, a wind project, for example, in your neighborhood. So we have to somehow deal with this attitude-behavior gap, and it also means that, for example, if we measure very positive attitudes, we still don't know about real behavior. And then the third challenge is the very strong contextual and situational dependency of human behavior. So if we maybe understand very well behavior in a certain context, we just cannot know how maybe the same person or different people in different contexts would do in the same situation. So all the data that we have and we need to collect need to be very, very specific. We cannot ask people or observe maybe what people vote on a ballot decision in Switzerland on wind energy and think that this is the same as if they vote in a municipality on a concrete project. So it's all super specific, and obviously this is a challenge to measure behavior and to analyze it. The main methodological approach that we have is really to run large-scale surveys, and obviously we have a lot of attitudinal questions in these surveys, and this is also one reason why we normally cannot rely on observed, for example, data, for example, selling numbers, etc., because we also need to better understand these more attitudinal questions, what people think, and also more detailed sociodemographics. That's what we ask for in the survey. And then in order to overcome all the challenges that I was talking about before, we try to use, whenever possible, experiments. One typical example are so-called split ballot designs. Some also know better maybe the AB treatments. So basically you give different treatments to different people and investigate, because you have randomized your assignment to the different treatment, in how far the different groups differ, and this can inform you about real differences in these treatments. Another very popular approach are conjoint experiments, and this is something that is normally used to identify or to measure multidimensional decisions. I have an example here for you. In a project, we try to identify what kind of shared PV projects are most acceptable to people. In which type of projects would people invest? And so we defined, that's the 5 dimensions you see on the left in bold, 5 attributes of how one can describe such projects, and we also identified several attribute levels. For example, for the provider, a large company can be a provider, a local farm, but we also had several other providers. And then in a randomized procedure, you basically create hypothetical projects, project A, project B, and people in the survey then need to evaluate which one they prefer, how much they would actually invest, how many modules they would want to buy, and finally we also asked about generally, even if you don't invest, would you accept such a project close to where you live? So in this screen, we try to overcome social desirability because this is actually mimicking real-world multidimensional decisions. Somebody can say, I don't like this project, but you never know why exactly he doesn't like it, and this helps that people are honest in their response behavior. Independent of how we collect the data, we then normally run statistical analysis, and by statistical analysis in my world, this means mostly regression-based analysis, standard regressions, hierarchical regressions. We pool data cross-sectionally and over time to understand dynamics. Sometimes we are lucky and have some panel data, and sometimes we use a frequentist approach, and sometimes we also go for a Bayesian approach. So quite diverse quantitative approaches. And if we go in that direction, the implicit goal often is causal inference. So we want to understand what's the effect of a measure on human behavior or attitudes. But this is not always possible, obviously, and sometimes, and I think that's really important, sometimes it's also quite useful to just have description, to understand patterns in the data that you have, so by clustering, grouping the individuals, for example. So we also use some more descriptive approaches to, as I said, to just observe the patterns in the data. And just to illustrate this to you, I want to present to you very few examples, very briefly, on how actually we did that so far, and especially in the context of Sweet Edge, which is one of these large consortia funded by SFOE, and which also enabled us to run a large-scale survey. We did the survey in 2022 in the midst of the energy crisis, I have to say that. This led to a very high response rate because everybody was interested about energy questions. So we had, in the end, almost 5,000 respondents. And we say, okay, the sample is quite representative for the Swiss population, so this means that it fits quite well to the main distributions regarding gender, age, education, not so well related to income. And yeah, for example, then we use the data to show what energy sources people prefer. So here we ask basically which of the following energy sources would you want to have in the future energy mix. And you see quite nice differences between, for example, electricity import and PV on buildings. And obviously, to come back to my first part, this is now something like a general preference. I mean, you can observe some patterns, some more acceptable and less acceptable energy sources, but it's quite obvious that this does not necessarily translate, for example, into behavior. We see that very well. For example, if we talk about larger projects, even though these technologies or the energy sources are well accepted, we normally see quite some opposition in the real world, so to say. Another example is we actually had some questions on, have you already adopted PV? And Also, if not, would you like to do it? Several questions, and based on these several questions, we could identify 3 groups of respondents: those who have already adopted PV, those who we rate to be likely adopters, meaning that they have several characteristics that imply that these people likely adopt in the future, and those who basically say, no, I'm not interested. Here we have a nice example of self-reported or even intended behavior, which is even more diffuse, I would say. And we also might have some social desirability problem here, because obviously everybody knows that it would be good, socially desirable, to invest in such installations. And so some people might have indicated to have adopted even though they have not. Or even more so, if they have not, they might have indicated that they likely do in the future if they in reality will never do. But still, some patterns, for example, we see that almost half of the respondents even indicate that they will never adopt, and this is quite an interesting finding. Now, as I said before, we also try to have experimental studies, and here I want to present to you one of the most complex study we actually did on the role of policy goals. And the goal here is actually talking much about goals that we observe that in public discussions, if we discuss about measures in order to mitigate climate change, it's all about costs and benefits. Most people and parties, they often say it's too costly and it doesn't really bring benefits, etc. And so our interest was actually to measure, to evaluate in how far goal information, so what is actually the goal of the policies and what can these policies achieve as a goal, if this affects the acceptance of ambitious policy mixes, so different instruments that could be introduced. For example, subsidize for PV, regulation that you need to have PV on new buildings, etc. And we did so by creating an experiment. Actually, this is wrong. It's not 1 treatment and 3 control groups, but the other way around. 1 control group. This group only received 3 randomly chosen policy mixes and needed to indicate which one is the preferred one. And then we had 3 treatment groups. 1 first saw an information about the official policy goal of Switzerland. It also varied at different levels, but doesn't really matter. And then needed to select the policy they preferred. 1 needed to choose their own goal, which they thought was the right one for Switzerland, and then needed to select a policy. And the 3rd one saw descriptions of the policies alongside with information about which goals these policies likely achieve. And the finding is quite interesting because it shows that there are 2 paths to higher acceptance of more ambitious policies. The first one is the first group that has a significantly higher likelihood to go for the ambitious policy mixes are those who have selected their own ambitious goal. And it's important to note this is now not just self-selection, because also among those who have, like, for example, high climate concern, we find this effect. So between those who have the same values, those who were able to select their own goal are more likely to also go for higher policies. And the second one is those who saw the policy descriptions alongside with the information about what can the policy actually achieve, also were much more likely to adopt or to accept more ambitious policies. And I think that's a very interesting example we are trying our best using experiments, and we see, maybe without respondents knowing, that something is going on in their minds, but it's still not observed data, obviously. And this brings me to the last slide. So some ideas, reflections, also first tries sometimes, where we might use AI and machine learning. One is to have a plausibility check. Just one example, we have this self-reported intention to install PV in the future, and it would be interesting to match this with real-world data 2 years later, how many people actually did so. And this would obviously require some more sophisticated data gathering strategies. Normally we act very theoretically, so we have some hypotheses and we test these hypotheses, but if you don't find anything, it would be interesting to use maybe machine learning to also detect non-expected patterns in the data, which we normally are quite blind for. A third one that we already tested, my collaborator combined survey data from such a conjoint experiment with real-world data, and then tried to predict like acceptance of policies that are not yet implemented. This could be interesting for policymakers. And then also to somehow translate or transfer the experimental approaches that we have to the real world. For example, then having maybe web pages, online tools, whatever, where we could gather data on what people actually see, look at, I don't know, and how they really use this information and translate it into behavior. This is actually almost all wishful thinking, so it would be very interesting for me to hear your ideas, inputs, maybe skills, what you could do to link maybe your skills to my data. Thank you very much.